All right, we're going to get started. Folks could take your seats. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our third session of the day. And today's session is Connections and Impact Clark in the Community. And I'm joined, my name is Eric DeMolinaire. I'm faculty in the Education Department. I'm the director of a fairly new major at Clark called Community Youth and Education Studies, which really engages our students in doing community engaged work. And I'm joined by my colleagues to my left, Lori Ross, who's a member of the IDCE department. And they'll each introduce themselves. Professor Don Spratt, who's in the biochemistry department, and Shelley Tenenbaum, who's in the sociology department. And today, what we thought we would do is offer some stories about our own experiences with community engagement that we think offer some insights about its value. And at Clark, we feel like community engaged scholarship is really core to us. Our motto is Challenge Convention, Change the World. And you can't change the world unless you're engaged with it. And so I'm going to start with the story today about an experience I had working in a school not too far from here, high school, and collaborating with students, which I think offers a metaphor that I want to share with you about the value of the knowledge that the community has to offer. So I'll share that story and then we'll pass it along. So several years ago, one of my first few years here at Clark, I started a critical friends group, a critical inquiry group with a group of teachers at Claremont Academy. And we were reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Paulo Freire and learning about critical pedagogies. And some of the teachers at the end of our first year together said, Eric, let's do this for real. Let's co-teach this with our students. And I was like, well, the principal's never going to go for that. So I let them go and try to research it. And of course, they came back to me and they said, yes, we can do it with a group of seniors at Claremont. And so we created this class, which was called Sociology on their transcript. But for us, it was called Roots and Roots. We wanted to look at their histories, right? Their communities and trajectories that brought them there, but also where they were going in life and how it connected. And we connected that class with a first year intensive of my colleague who was teaching a group of first years at Clark, thinking about Maine South and the communication. And that was part of the communication major. And so in that class, the first time we brought the high school students together with the college students, we decided we want to do some activities where they could get to know each other and connect. And so we gave them all in groups. So we put them in groups of about 7. It was 4 high school students with 2 or 3 college students. And the high school students, and they each would get a camera, and we sent them out to capture pictures that reflected the following 4 terms: self, home, community, and dreams. And so they went out to capture those images. And one group set out, and it was a group of young men, and they walked, right? I think we were meeting over in Dana Commons, and then they went out and I think we're walking on campus and thinking about where to go. And some of the college students said, let's go over across the street to the convenience store there, and let's get I want to get some sodas or something. And one of the high school students said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. I'd rather not do that. And the college students, thinking about what was happening, it sort of said, we'll pay for it, don't worry, thinking that they maybe needed support that way. And that wasn't the concern at all. And the high school student said, well, if we go over there, there might be some trouble. And the college students were it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just after school, totally daylight, and said, let's just go. And for whatever reason, the college students convinced all those high school students to go over there. And what they didn't know, and what I find interesting, is that the high school student didn't communicate their resistance to going more. He had never been across Main Street in 5 years because he was a member of a rival gang that territory occupied. And when they went across the street, sure enough, several students from the rival gang got on their phones, called their friends, and started approaching this group. And so the first thing was the college students were just kind of blown away that this is a reality that's happening in the streets right around our campus. And secondarily, like the student was ready to like start fighting, and that I think freaked everybody. And so there was a bit of words exchange, and finally they convinced the students to all leave, and they ran across the street and hid in one of Clark's buildings actually, and called one of my co-teachers to come and get them out. And they got out, and we dealt with that, and there was a lot of conversations that happened afterwards. But I offered this story as a metaphor because I think it speaks to not only the importance of community engagement, but sort of the disposition and stance that we from the academy have to take. And in that, what I'm saying is that that the college students had assumptions about what was happening that they didn't know. And oftentimes, the people in the community are the very people who have the knowledge and information that could guide us all to safety, and yet we fail to tap into it regularly enough. And so the sort of, for me, the story leaves us with a couple questions. The first questions are sort of, what are the misguided assumptions that we all have about the world? And how do we work with folks in the community to help us challenge and check our own assumptions? And then secondly, how can we learn to listen to the truth being shared by the community? And sometimes, you know, I called this talk originally when I first did it, and I go into a little more detail, and I won't here, but like the heart of listening, like how do we really listen to what people are saying and let go of our assumptions, right? And so that we can actually access the knowledge that might protect us all, that might keep us all safe. And lastly, how do we start to build the trust with community? Because part of the reason that happened is that this high school student wasn't willing to share some of his truths, right? And why is that? And so how do we build the trust so we can, and what are the things that is getting in the way of that trust? And so I leave you with that to get us started, and I'll pass it over to Laurie.
All right. Thanks, Eric. My opening story is about my mistake. Not my student's mistake, but Laurie Ross, I teach in the Community Development and Planning program in the Department of International Development, Community and Environment. Don't speak for the neighborhood. It isn't your place. As I heard those words coming angrily at me over the phone by a neighborhood leader, my stomach sank. I felt sick. An article had come out in the Telegram and Gazette that day about a project that we were working on in Maine South. I'd been interviewed for the story, and the paper published some of my impressions about the neighborhood. As I ran through the content of the story in my head, I felt myself getting defensive and wondering, why didn't I have the right to speak? She went on to say that my voice wasn't the one that was needed in that story, that I should have moved aside and referred the reporter to a neighborhood resident, that I should always refer reporters to residents when they have questions about the neighborhood. So that was a lot. This was maybe a decade ago at this point, but I spent a lot of time in that moment reflecting on that, and it still kind of stings that happened. And I wish I could say that taught me everything I needed to know about community engagement, but it didn't. So I'll tell you some more stories. Today, I work and I serve as the research partner to something called the Governance Council on Children, Youth, and Families. The Governance Council is chaired by Worcester's city manager and mayor, and it's made up of leaders of different sectors in the city, the schools, the police, the district attorney. The entity was formed to enhance communication and collaboration across sectors, to help facilitate the sharing of information and data, and ultimately it's meant to increase accountability to the community for the results around the efforts of this initiative. And there are 3 community-based coalitions that are part of the Governance Council, focusing on early childhood, health equity, and youth violence. And so as the research partner, I do a lot of stuff with data, like data's my thing, right? I process data on a monthly basis. I receive data from the schools, the police, the DA, early education and care providers. I put together like a data dashboard for every month for them to discuss. And so part of what I do is also facilitate conversations around the data, unless it's not my role to facilitate that conversation. So kind of reflecting back on the other story, sometimes I'm not the right person to facilitate the conversation. And then every 3 years, we create an assessment of the drivers of youth violence And in this most current iteration, we were really focusing on the persistence of racial inequity in youth violence outcomes. And in that work, we collaborated directly with people involved, either professionally or with lived experience of violence. And so probably not surprisingly, this work raises up a lot of moral dilemmas, particularly a conflict between sort of my mission around supporting the creation of just and anti-oppressive spaces for young people and with young people, and that I'm taking much more of an insider role in this work, working with the leadership committee rather than always working directly with community. And so that conflict is kind of shapes the next story. And that was around the mission of the Worcester Youth Violence Prevention Initiative. And I'm just going to read to you quickly what the original mission was. The Youth Violence Prevention Initiative was founded on the mission to reduce violence in the city by eliminating structural racism and promoting trust, safety, healing, and opportunities for our most under-resourced youth and families. And we lived with that mission for about 18 months. We operated with it. The group met. We read the mission at the first meeting. It didn't raise any eyebrows. We actually were surprised that it didn't. But as we started sharing data on inequities that we were seeing, some of the stakeholders were not pleased and kind of said that they didn't believe that structural racism was actually a factor in their institutions and that they would leave the initiative if we didn't address that. And so, you know, a lot of back and forth, and ultimately we did change the mission and took out structural racism and replaced it with structural violence. The definition of structural violence is still about structural racism, but that appeased them. They stayed at the table. But taking and changing the language is a signal to the community, right? And so it sort of sits with me as a decision we made that, in a sense, concentrates power with the most powerful. And I'll just tell one more quick story. You know, there are small and satisfying moments in the work that involve data. You know, we put together data on school discipline, and this week the city's Commissioner of Health and Human Services called because she saw our most recent data dashboard on school discipline and a disturbing uptick in all types of discipline just from February to March of this year. So very recent, very current. Emergency removals were up, in-school suspensions are up, out-of-school suspensions are up, and long-term suspensions are up. And long-term suspensions are the kinds of thing that have young people out of their schools and into alternative school programs, which is a factor in the school to prison pipeline. And so the commissioner called me to let me know that she called the superintendent right away to learn more and has already set in motion some plans to look at resources to divert young people from long-term suspensions. And so just to reflect on some of my learning around my role as a research partner in this work in Worcester is one that, you know, data are complex, right? The same set of data can tell multiple stories. And so we have to take a lot of care in how they're constructed, managed, used, and who's using them. And I've learned that whether it's qualitative or quantitative, data is currency, right? Data is power. It can be withheld, it can be shared, it can be leaked, it can be interpreted, it can be misinterpreted, it can be buried, it can be disseminated. And all of that is understanding the politics around the data that really matter. And so that's something that I try to share with my students. Partnership work is a very delicate dance. It's about navigating power, navigating relationships. It requires skill and bravery and experience and reflection. It's a lifelong process and also one that I try to talk to with my students. And then finally, you know, change happens at a glacial pace, but it's been shared with me multiple times that slow can be fast. And so we have to be intentional about the long game, but you never know when opportunities will come up, like the one with the commissioner who was upset about the suspensions and acted immediately. So we always have to be ready in this kind of partnership work. So these are some of my reflections. I'm really super curious kind of what people think about the insider role I have taken, and I will pass it on to Don.
All right, thanks, Lori. Hi, everybody. I'm Don Spratt. I'm an associate professor in the Carlson School of Chemistry and Biochemistry at Clark University. I'm also the chair of the graduate of the chemistry program. So usually when I get a crowd together, I like to start with a joke. So if you bear with me for a second. So For those of you who don't know me, I'm a proud Canadian. I was born in, right on. How's it going, eh?
There's always one in the crowd, right?
Always one. Token Canadian. So I am a proud Canadian, love hockey, love maple syrup. I'm also a diehard Toronto Maple Leafs fan. And for those of you that know hockey, they haven't won the Stanley Cup since '67. So to put in perspective, last time the Leafs won, there were 6 teams in the NHL. They're now 32. And gas was 24 cents a gallon. So it's been a long time coming. Years ago, and I was very excited about this until I turned it over. So instead of just having my last name saying Spratt, it has my initials D.E. Spratt, but read it aloud, it says Desperate. So luckily I found a job here at Clark about 7 years ago, and I just got tenured this past year. Because it's an audience of people from not Clark, I thought I'd take a moment to sort of talk about some of the amazing science and history of research at Clark. So many of you know about Robert Goddard, the father of modern rocketry. We have Buzz Aldrin's signed book that he took to the moon. Sigmund Freud came here in 1909 and gave us lectures. We have that wonderful statue outside that the students like to decorate every year. Wind chill factor. Not the real temperature, what it really feels like, was developed by a geographer here at Clark. Birth control pill was also developed here by Gregory Pincus back in the 1950s. First Nobel Prize winner that was American-born did his research here at Clark in physics as well. And on top of that, we've had some pretty cool history of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Bruce Springsteen, and the Grateful Dead. So Clark's hip, and we've got a really cool history in science. So what I thought I'd do is I'd start off and say, hello, I'm a biochemist. And usually when I go to a party, this is what I see. People just shut down around me, and that's not what I want. Science is really cool, and one of the things that I want to sort of help inspire a lot of students to do these days is to actually think about what they can do with science. So one of the things I'd like to ask a lot of students is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And most of them start to say things, and then one question I follow up was, do your future plans require knowledge in STEM? And 95% of the time, everybody's hand shoots up. And if it doesn't shoot up, I tell them why they probably need STEM, and they go, oh, I didn't think about that. So a few years ago when I first came here, I was a junior faculty member, and I had many senior students walking into my office, and they were freaking out about what they wanted to do when they grew up. And I went through 3 boxes of Kleenexes, and I'm like, I got to get teaching credit for this. So I developed a course called Leaping into a Science Career, which is a play on words for LEAP curriculum here at Clark, Liberal Education, Effective Practice. So what I did is I gathered students together once a year, and we talk about how to look for job advertisements, what the job advertisement is saying, recognizing how the scientific skills they acquire at Clark and other places can be applied to different job settings and situations. What you do now is not what you're going to do in the future, but how you go about doing is what matters. Learn how to tailor and construct effective cover letters, resumes, and other application materials. Some students have no idea how to even start with a resume or even write an effective cover letter and sort of show their assets and how they're going to help a company. And 4, and this is probably the most important, how to become a confident, hardworking scientist ready to take on new challenges in your future careers. Many scientists can be shy, but not all of us are shy. And I try to make them come out of their shells. So what we do here is I actually have former Clarkies come back and actually talk about what they've done since they've left Clark. And it's really a powerful way to tell stories for students to hear about this. So soon after this course was all developed, I was at a holiday party, and I met a teacher from Worcester Public Schools, and they were looking for an internship possibility for some of their students. And before I knew it, I was running a whole biochemistry outreach program through Clark. So I've actually had about 150 students come to Clark on field trips so far, and they come and actually spend a day with me doing a university lab experience, purifying these beautiful tubes, which are full of jellyfish protein. So the protein that glows in jellyfish, these are just different variants of them, and they all do TikTok videos and have fun. And we do a tour of the research facilities, and then we have a serious conversation about STEM career options, and I send them on their way after that. Now, unfortunately, with COVID really put a screeching halt to this whole thing. So I was looking at a 2-month break during the winter intersession. I'm like, I'm going to be bored. What can I do? So I reached out to many different high school teachers around the area, and I actually was able to host Zoom sessions talking about science careers with these many schools in the area as well, stemming from Holden, Leicester, Upton, and many schools throughout the neighborhood as well. And many of those schools are now connecting with me and coming to Clark for field trips in the future as well. So this is a great opportunity to sort of get students inspired about chemistry, biochemistry, biotech, and just trying to get their hands in the lab and doing something different than they're not used to. So it takes a village to run a lab, but I want to say we're funded by the NIH, AbbVie, and Protein Society and Atomwise. These are different companies that sort of help support this type of initiative and things. And these are my collaborators and things. But that's all I have to really say right now. But what I want to do is say thank you for listening, and I'll pass it off to Shelley.
Wow, great. Hi, I'm Shelley Tenenbaum, and I co-chair the Department of Sociology, and I direct an undergraduate program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And this is wonderful for me to have the opportunity to hear about the incredible work that my colleagues are doing, so thank you. My newest hat over the last few years has been that I also teach in college and prison programs. And I've been teaching at 2 medium security prisons here in Massachusetts, MCI Norfolk and MCI Concord. For those of you who have read the autobiography of Malcolm X, these 2 institutions may be familiar because those are the 2 prisons where Malcolm X was incarcerated. I think it was between 1946 and 1952. And by bringing in Clark students, Clark undergraduates and graduate students as teaching assistants, students on both sides of the wall have the opportunity to interact with each other. And much of the discussion on college and prison programs focuses, as it should, on the transformative power of education for incarcerated people. But I think it's also important to recognize that the experience of teaching in prison also changes those of us who cross the inside-outside divide. And that transformation is a 2-way process. So what I'm going to try to give you a sense, I'm also going to be telling you stories, and I just want to give you a little bit of a glimpse of days in the life of a college and prison professor. Because teaching in prison brings a variety of rewards, big rewards, intellectual excitement, deep appreciation from students, a sense of accomplishment, and new perspectives. But there are also emotional costs of teaching in prison. There's incredible anxiety, sadness, frustration, and anger. And it's simultaneously holding on to very opposite reactions that really contributes to the intensity of teaching in prison. It even poses challenges for talking about the experience in venues like this. Because when I describe the thrill of gaining new insights, when I describe moments of kindness, even moments of laughter, I take a risk of romanticizing life behind bars. And there is nothing romantic about being locked up. So the courses that I teach in prison are the same exact courses I teach here in Clark. These are college programs. At Norfolk, students get their BAs from Boston University. At Concord, from Emerson. So I teach the same courses that I teach here at Clark on race and my course on genocide in the college and prison programs. So not surprisingly, these sociology courses tend to bring up a lot of personal experience. There's room for that in sociology classes, particularly on the topics that I teach. So story after story emerged of adolescent anger, and these are real connections to the work that Lori does, because many of my students were in those alternative high schools and in juvenile detention and were part of that pipeline from school to prison. So story after story of adolescent anger that was escalated by trauma, violence, poverty, and racism surfaced in class. Many of my students, when they were children, saw friends and family members who were killed right before their eyes. Many of my students grew up with so much fear and anxiety that they have been diagnosed with PTSD. Many were imprisoned for their first time when they were young teens, before they committed crimes that resulted in their being in these medium security prisons for men. and they are serving very long sentences. Almost all my students have life sentences with parole, and some of my students have life sentences without parole and are never getting out. And the students' understanding of their younger selves as well as of their adult selves, their ability to describe their vulnerabilities, their regrets, their feelings of remorse, often leave me in awe. So the students in my classes, men who express emotions and devote serious effort to their studies, I tell you, teaching in prison is in some ways a professor's dream. My students do all the reading. They come to class prepared. They appreciate me so much. It's actually, sorry, I shouldn't touch that thing. It's actually touching. I'll make a confession. I hope not too many of my students are here, but I've been teaching here for so long. I don't usually reread, texts that I've assigned many times. When I teach in prison, I have to read everything with a fine-tooth comb because after a number of times of getting questions about particular parts of a text that didn't even sound familiar to me and giving answer after, I'll get back to you on this next week, I realized I better do a better job of being prepared. So again, the students in my class are men who express emotions, devote very serious effort to their studies. They in no way resemble the dangerous, hypermasculine stereotype that's portrayed not only in popular culture, but also in some academic scholarship. And I didn't even realize the extent to which I had these stereotypes buried in my head until they were refuted time and time again. The men, the students in my class, talk about how important it is to them that they make their families proud that they're college students, their pride that they encourage younger family members as well as other men in prison to continue their education. And again, they're often the first members of their family to be enrolled in college. The students show emotional vulnerability. I still remember one time, one of my students, because he was in prison for so long, and unfortunately, this isn't uncommon, he had lost contact with family over his decades of being behind bars. And BU was having their annual commencement. He was graduating. That's another whole story, another very moving moment, being able to participate in a graduation in prison. It's an incredible event. Anyway, he, after class, told me how he was graduating, but no one from his family would be there at the commencement. So I just, said to him, I'll be there, and I'm planning to attend, and I'll be there to see you graduate. And he got very emotional, and then he says, I'm about to cry, which he did. So he started to cry. And we then laughed when he said that I was ruining his rep as a hardcore criminal by making him cry. And it was just one of those moments, and there are many of teaching in prison, literally I'm suspended, in these opposite emotions, in this case, literally suspended between crying and laughing. The students in my class practice yoga, meditation. Many of them train service dogs. It's another whole thing about prison it was bizarre when I first got there. Prison's not the prettiest place. And yet there are these men walking around with these unbelievable dogs. With the little backpacks, they're so beautiful, well-behaved. In my class, I often have one or two service dogs in class. The men are involved at working with at-risk youth, and they are involved with restorative justice. So another short story. And it was one of the most powerful experiences that I have had while teaching in prison, maybe one of the most powerful experiences I've had in my life, is when I was invited to a restorative justice session at MCI Concord. And by bringing together victims of crime and people who committed crime, Restorative justice focuses on repairing harm rather than on seeking retribution. So this group of, it's a session, the men had already been meeting for months, maybe even it was close to a year at this point, and actually to prepare for this particular day when two mothers whose sons had been killed were coming to speak with them. And while it may seem unimaginable that this group of women and men would voluntarily put themselves in such an emotionally raw situation, the opportunity to talk together clearly meant so much to every person sitting around that circle. The mothers, the women talked, and the men listened to their excruciating pain of loss and how their lives, their children's lives, had unraveled in the aftermath of these tragedies. The men acknowledged the mother's sorrow and agony, and they expressed heartfelt remorse for their contributions to a culture of violence. And their words seemed to bring comfort to the mothers, and in turn, the women's acknowledgement of the sincerity of the men's remorse seemed to make a dent in the burden that they carried. And I've never before, and may never again, witness such honesty, sincerity, and generosity of heart and spirit as I did in that prison room. So by expanding horizons through the exploration of ideas, college and prison programs are empowering sites for liberating minds. They provide students with dignity, with self-esteem, a sense of accomplishment, as well as with a place for exploring new questions about identity. The transformative power of education on students' lives is, of course, at the heart of any college and prison program. I hope that I have played a small role in my students' lives, but I can only speak with authority about how I have been transformed by teaching in college and prison programs. The students' engagement with ethical questions has expanded my thinking about morality, and their willingness to share their emotional vulnerability has made me a more compassionate human being. So the studious and inquisitive students who were kind to me and to each other overturned my preconceived notions about men sitting behind bars. And as my blinders were lifted, I came to understand the imperative to create a more merciful criminal justice system that recognizes that people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, some of my students are even in their 60s, are very different than the people who they were in their early teens or even in their early 20s. And defining people for the rest of their lives by the worst, and I'm talking about really the worst, and it shouldn't be, I don't mean to be minimizing the crimes that people perpetrated. These were the worst moments of their youth. That is not a basis of a system that has the word justice in its title. Most of all, the students have inspired me to believe in people's capacity to change. Thank you. So we really wanted to make sure to give time for audience participation. I know some of the sessions, it seemed like there was quite a bit of talking from the stage, and many of you, I'm sure, are involved in community engagement. We'd love to hear your stories and, of course, any questions that you have for us.
Well, and first, let me also say that there is, for those of you joining online, I think they'll put a URL up of a place where you can offer questions online, and they'll read them. And then Ashley, am I getting your name right? Ashley has a microphone, and so if you want to ask a question or share, you can raise your hand, and we want everyone to speak into the mic because people are online.
Thanks very much for this. My name's Dennis Dimitri, class of 75. And your stories, your anecdotes are all very powerful, particularly yours, Shelley. But I have to ask you this question since you're all academicians. Have you had an opportunity to take a look and study what you've done and figure out what outcomes have been changed in ways that could be reproduced by others in other settings so that the anecdotal, wonderful stories you've told could be turned into something that could be spread across other communities?
I guess I can start. So there is a journal that I'm planning on publishing some of this stuff in called the Journal of Chemical Education and sharing some of the aspects of the outreach program I've been doing at Clark. And that's going to involve, I have to talk to some people in psychology to set up a questionnaire to make sure I get the input and output type of work, right? So I got to go through IRB to get that to happen. But that is one of the plans I have for the overall arching program eventually in the future.
And I mean, there's many aspects of, I think, the work that we're doing that is replicable. When I think about this governance group, it's really a form of organizational change. In order to make systems and structures work more effectively. So that's one piece of it. Another piece is kind of the assessment process. So we've published some pieces around the assessment work and how doing this kind of community data gathering process leads to interventions that are more effective. So through some of this work, we've actually created early childhood trauma interventions so that we're intervening at the point of trauma really to prevent what Shelley's talking about and to agree what Eric was also talking about. So we do, we do take the data and we do also write for scholarly journals about it and create interventions with an evidence base.
Yeah, and I would say, from my perspective, like this work has multiple impacts, right? So for me, I believe it should change the way we teach, right? So that part of the thought, I mean, the work we're doing is about knowledge construction. And so where do we seek and how do we even define notions of expertise and whose knowledge is valued in our society? And so I think I'm doing a lot of work to try to disrupt some of those notions. I'm co-authoring with high school youth at times in some academic journals. And then I think, for me, it's also about rethinking how we learn at Clark, right? So we created a new major where our students are doing work in the community alongside youth sometimes in classrooms and building knowledge that way rather than just simply absorbing it through text or lectures, but actually sort of building it in the world. And then secondarily, for me, and I've written extensively about this too, right? The goal is not simply to increase learning on an academic space, but actually to have an impact in the world. And so for me, the real piece is to think about how are we even measuring social change work and how do we come to understand that and what is the role of doing that work with community members, because we sometimes think we're doing something that's creating a change and we might actually be creating more harm. And so how do we actually really dive deep into that? And so I think you're right, we need to do intensive documentation. And I've written a lot about those different, even the processes of gathering knowledge as well as impacts and outcomes.
So thank you for your question. And the way that I would answer it is I am also publishing, actually my first article is coming out about teaching in prison in a wonderful book. Brandeis University Press is publishing it on teaching behind the walls. And all about the book is really, the editor calls it an anti-handbook. So it's really about best practices for teaching in prison. So that is, I think, going to be a very helpful anthology that's coming out. And I guess I also work a lot with Clark students. Before COVID, we had 30 Clark students who were volunteer tutors in prison education programs through a program maybe familiar to some of you called PD Green. Bringing in, again, as I mentioned at the outset of the talk, bringing in Clark students with me every semester as TAs, graduate students and undergraduate. Some of you may have met Haley Wilder during your visit here, certainly the members of the board who's helping to coordinate. She was one of my TAs when I taught at Norfolk. And this is where my work now connects directly to Lori's, is through Clark, along with two colleagues, John Dobson and Jen Plant, we received a grant. And this fall, we're starting a new program, Liberal Arts for Returning Citizens. And formerly incarcerated people will be taking college classes. We're starting off with 3 courses in the fall and 3 in the spring. We'll earn Clark credit. And one of the groups that we're reaching out to very deliberately are students in the alternative high schools, who Lori has mentioned, to encourage the students to take college classes. So those are some of my answers, at least to your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Each one of your presentations was truly inspiring, and I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to hear about your work.
Mary Jane, just introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Mary Jane Ryan. I work as the Executive Director of the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I've been at Clark for 18 years now. It's hard to believe. And it's just wonderful to hear about some of this work that I don't always have the opportunity to come into contact with it and hear the details. So I'm really grateful. It strikes me in hearing about it that what you're doing is the exact opposite of the ivory tower, where you think of a university as being far removed from what's happening in the community that surrounds it. And I always feel so proud to be at Clark and to be involved with a community like this educational community that does touch our broader Worcester community. And I live in Worcester, as I know some of you on the panel do as well. I'm just wondering, what is it about Clark in particular? And maybe there isn't something about Clark. Maybe this could happen at any institution. But is there something about Clark in particular that makes it better suited to reach out in this way? I mean, I think about the fact that as an institution, we really kind of, forgive the use of this word, but we bleed into the community. We don't have a wall around us. You don't know when you're on the Clark campus and when you've wandered into, the surrounding Worcester community. And for me, that's often a metaphor about how we interact. And so I'm wondering, can you say something about what it is about this work at Clark in particular that fosters it and makes it possible?
I think we should let Jack answer that question. Jack Foley should answer that question.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say a couple things. I think you're right. Oh, were you going to say go, Jack? I mean, you mentioned the visual. Like when I was in Oakland, I used to live in Oakland, and I started a school in Oakland, and we did a lot of work with Mills College, which is a women's college in the heart of East Oakland, and our school was like 5 blocks away from it. And so we did some work actually doing biophotonics with folks from UC Davis and folks at Mills, and we would go there, and like we literally would walk to the back of it, and the complete campus was surrounded by like fences with barbed wire, and then we'd call, and the security would come and open the back gate because it would be like a long walk to go all the way around, and we'd walk in. And I remember the first time going in, and my high school students were like, "Oh my gosh, there's a river in Oakland? Like, where's the river? Like, it goes underground after it leaves the campus." And so there, I think the visual structure, architecture matters on one level. And then I think the other thing, and I would say this as a positive and a caution, right? That Clark celebrates us going into the community. And that sometimes can be problematic. Like I was doing a film project with youth in the community, and media wanted to do a story about it. And so I said, well, talk to the students, the high school students. They're the ones who are doing this work. I just like construct, the space, but they're doing all the work. And so they interviewed all the students, and then the article was all about me going into the community doing this work. And so sometimes we miss the messaging, I think, which is about how do we get the young people's voices or the community voices rather than me being some white savior, right? And so I think it's important, but I think that it at least speaks to the value, right? That Clark wants to tell these stories. Maybe they don't always tell it the exact right way, but we want to be engaged. I've been, all the stuff that I've written co-authored with teachers or with high school students is not seen as like less than scholarship and stuff like that. So I think there's ways to have it structured in our tenure process as well.
Yeah, and I would love to actually really hear from Jack Foley, but my take, well, I'm just going to say one thing first, if that's okay. And I'm be dating myself, but when I first came to Clark a long time ago, decades ago, over 3 decades ago, the president's house was right near WPI, right, off of Salisbury Street or on Salisbury. We used to go there for all the functions. So there was a big shift that happened under then President Traina, and the move of the president's house to the campus was very important symbolically. And that's when there was a real shift to Clark wanting of capitalizing on our location, rather than, for a long time, it was seen as a liability. There was talk at one point, I remember, I don't think it went anywhere, about moving Clark away from Worcester. And so there was a real shift, and the shift was to have a partnership with the community. You know, in the 50s, it was really bad when Clark switched from being a commuter school to a residential school. We just leveled a lot of triple deckers in order to build the dorms. And there was a lot of very bad will between Maine South and Clark. And then there was a real shift, and a lot of effort was built into building the partnership. And I think it really was very different, and a lot of then what Eric just said absolutely resonates from my own experience of building partnerships is really seen as a strength, and that we're encouraged to do so as faculty. But I would love to hear from
And Jack was involved in a lot of that
all
shift.
of this, yeah.
My PowerPoint presentation's at 5 o'clock tonight, so I destroyed all those PowerPoints. Just a quick comment on the question. It really started with Dick Traina back when he came here in 1984 as president. And Dick Traina had an upbringing that he would say was somewhat similar to the children in this neighborhood here. And people saw something in Dick as a young child and gave him opportunities. And he said he wanted to play it back. And he said that Clark had to be engaged in this community, admittedly for self-interest, because we were concerned what was happening in our neighborhood. But it was also at the heart of Dick Traina and who he was to make sure we were part of this community. Yeah. We typically call it an alignment of enlightened self-interest by bringing together all these special common goals that we share with our community. My comment is going for the next 5 years, since all of you are still here, and I love the work that you're doing. But what's going to happen in the next 5 years, and I would make a pitch. Clark has done great work with education, public education in this neighborhood. It's one of the critical issues we're facing in the city of Worcester. How do we enhance our K-12 or even pre-K-12 education? We have a new superintendent coming here in Worcester this summertime, and she is really interested in transformative, genuine partnerships. So I would love to see Clark take a lead role at bringing all the colleges together to work with the new superintendent to find a way to really engage the colleges in a significant way in the public schools, in an impactful way in the schools. Everyone's doing a lot of work, but it's kind of disjointed. How do we coordinate that in a way, not just academically, but also at some of the adverse childhood experiences that have been referenced a couple times here, the trauma students face on a daily basis and post-pandemic. So I would love to see Clark take a leadership role in galvanizing the colleges in Worcester to work with the public schools.
That's great.
Thank you.
And you should note that he recently retired from Clark, but also from the school committee. And clearly, though, he hasn't really embraced retirement.
Can you set up the appointment with her?
Hi, Paul Matthew, Harvard Medical School, but I'm actually here representing Seton Hall University, where I did my undergrad here in lieu of the president. Thank you for your great presentations. I appreciate them. And that white savior comment actually made me think of the diversity and inclusion work I work on. And I think a really important word that we all need to keep in mind is allyship. Whenever I write on this topic, I always try to incorporate co-authors of different ages, different races, different backgrounds, So not only is it a shared story, but if there's anything controversial or things that people really don't resonate well with, basically they can't single out any one author that's written on it, and it's seen as more of a collective. And then a question I had for Shelley, I commend you on the great work that you do. My question is whether you've worked with any female inmates, and if you haven't, whether there's opportunities to do so, because I certainly think they would also really do well with what you have to offer.
Yeah. No, I have not. Although for this new program, Liberal Arts for Returning Citizens, yes, we will. There will be women who were formerly incarcerated. Matter of fact, the first student who enrolled is female. So BU has the same program at MCI Framingham, which is the women's prison in the state, as well as MCI Norfolk. And when I first met with the director of the BU College and Prison program, I had wanted to work at MCI Framingham, but they really needed faculty in the men's prison. So then I started to work in the men's prison. So I have not, but it is something that I would very much like to do. And while women make up, as we all know, a much smaller percentage of people behind bars, they are the numbers, growing the fastest. So it's very serious. So I'll just say the one thing that happens that's a little bit more of a challenge of having a college and prison program for women than for men is that women have, in general, on average, much shorter sentences. One of the reasons that you can have a college and prison program at state prisons like Norfolk and Concord is because the men are there for so long. They could finish several degrees. But the women are in prison in general, on average, for much shorter sentences.
Thank you all so much for what you do and what you've told us. I've worked in community development for 40 years. My name is Sandra Abramson. I graduated in '68, and I was a member of the Worcester student movement where we went out and tutored at that time. And then at some point, I live in New York City, and I went to Seedco. A friend of mine worked at Seedco. Clark, I think under Dick Traynor, was there and was participating. One of the things that I'd ask you and everyone here is, what about including the kind of community work, and particularly the Maine South work or the Worcester education work, in a kind of strategic plan? That it's not, does this one want to join or that one, or this is a good idea. But I come out of a consulting background as well, that sense of creating a kind of strategic plan, because I think continuity in these kinds of programs are what's really going to make the difference in terms of the community and the relationship between Clark. It's wonderful that there is not the wall, but there's an invisible wall. And I think continuity of connection and relationship can work to tear down that invisible wall that I think exists.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Yes. The work that I've been doing has been in the context of long-term partnerships, right? So like I've been working, I think, with these kind of on this effort since 2006. And so when you talk about a strategic plan, there's the Clark side of it, and then there's the community side. And I think to date, they've been quite separate. But how do we bring them together? Maybe an exception would be the housing work. I mean, Jack, you should really be on the panel. But, the reason I think that the housing situation has changed in this neighborhood is because of several distinct strategic plans that where there was a deliberate partnership between Clark and the Maine South CDC in terms of really developing the housing stock. So I think we do have a model that shows it does work. And I think that's the challenge of how do we really have integrated strategic plans at our community and Clark.
And I would just add, a lot of us up here are dreamers and schemers and trying to figure out ways to do this work. And, Lori and Jack and I several years ago worked on a Promise Neighborhood grant where we were looking at cradle to career college. And what we found in the conversations we had with a lot of young people was that there's so many ways that people get off of a positive trajectory, right? And so, I can do all this work in schools, but if the housing causes problems or there's health issues or criminal justice system, like there's so many different forces at play that what I'm dreaming about is how do we get rid of the silos that happen within the universities, but also in our community organizing work so that we can start to think about holistic community wellness so that we're not letting one, I can do all this work and create an amazing school and then the student becomes evicted and they're not in the school anymore and what's happened, right? And so how are we thinking more comprehensively, holistically? And then how do we develop measures to think about community wellness that is not just in our specific areas of focus and work? And that's one of the challenges, I think, of doing community engaged work, because the academy values you like have a niche of knowledge that you become such a expert on. And in fact, what community needs is like breadth of wisdom and knowledge. And so navigating that is tricky, but yeah.
I'm Paminda Bachu. I teach at the sociology department. Shelley, I wondered, the work you do, I admire your ability to do it, because it seems to me, it seems to be so emotionally demanding, not only in terms of what you have to do yourself, but in understanding the lives of these people who've made a mistake at some time in their lives, and then they're paying for it for a lifetime. I mean, to me, that would make me so angry, it would make me beside myself. How do you have to see therapists? So how do you deal with, it seems like the hardest thing to do. I imagine myself having nightmares and sleepless nights or something like that. So I'm curious about how you appease yourself, or how do you deal with it?
I have great colleagues like you. Right? I think, no, it is hard. It's hard, but, let's see, how do I say this without not revealing, I don't want to reveal too much about myself, but my neuroses. Okay, it's just that, first of all, I get so much out of it. But something that happens, let me give an analogy. One good part, quote unquote, about teaching about genocide, directing the program, is whatever I'm going through, you really stop feeling sorry for yourself pretty quickly. And here too, that when people have it, the men in my classes have had really rough lives and are continuing to have very rough lives by being in prison. You think, I guess maybe, you focus a little bit less on yourself. But yes, as I started off, I do get very angry and I do get very sad as well. But I really get so much out of it. And a funny thing, too, about being in prison, again, where you're holding on to totally different emotions, is after this really unpleasant, and that's an understatement, entry process every time. I don't know how many of you have ever gone into prison, but the entry process is very unpleasant. You're searched, and I can't tell you, how many of those doors that are shutting behind you, being escorted by guards, how many times you have to sign your name at different steps of the way. But then you walk into the classroom and it's like any other classroom. There are desks and I'm in the front and there's students and so it's constantly, it's like, but then you'll have something happen that one day, one of your students, one of the hardest parts, Paminda, about teaching in prison is also when your students disappear. People disappear. They get transferred. They get put into solitary confinement. And I still remember the first time I had a student who was gone for a month because he was in solitary and I could barely teach. And my students are telling me I have to keep teaching because for them this is totally normal that someone's going into solitary, and I'm like reeling. But again, it's like that really highlighted for me how it's just like any other classroom, and yet it's totally different by being in the abnormal world of prison. So I don't think that's a very, necessarily coherent answer to your question. Because as I said, it's hard for me to talk about the experience precisely because of the issues you just raised. It's a jumble. It's a jumble of very intense emotions.
Okay, so I think this is a good way, because I know we're running out of time, but thank you. I didn't catch both your names, but thank you for your comments about why Clark and why and thinking about where to go next, because I know every single one of these panelists, like personally, I've worked with you the last 8 years, and the reason they do it is because they're authentic and they want to do it because they think it's important, not because they want a publication, not because they want some fancy grant from NIH or wherever. They do it because they want to do it. And I've worked with you, you've worked on grants, multiple grants. Some of them don't get funded, and you continue to do this work because you want to do this work. And I think that's what's so unique about Clark. I've been at the medical school for 8 years. I've been at Research One institutions. And sometimes you do that work because you need to get a grant to pay for your salary. That's not why any of you do it. And I've also worked with Don. We were on a curling team for a fundraiser. So it's a different kind of work. And we did get first place, second place, whatever. But anyway, that's why Clark. I've never seen such authentic people that do this kind of work. And you do it because you want to.
And Rosalie Torres Stone is another one of my colleagues in the sociology department. And Sarah Barry is sitting next to her, Alicia Cousins in front. And, so you guys really are just terrific. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Is that time? I think we're out. I'm seeing it.
There's
Great stories.